many ways the history of human culture, from the gods to God to Gaia, that theory that this earth is a kind of living organism, which sometimes we've referred to as Mother Earth, upon whom we depend for everything that sustains us in life, and which we have been slowly, without realising it, destroying. So that book has to deal with that. I think, Francis, perhaps that's enough for me at the moment.
Not quite.
Not quite.
You mentioned your books, but you didn't mention one of them, unless it was the similar name, Christianity Without God.
Ah, yes.
Didn't you do that?
Yes, thank you. Yes.
Because we want to hear just a little bit more about your God stuff.
Oh, good.
Yeah. The image of God has changed.
Good.
So we want to hear a little bit about that.
Christianity Without God came about in a funny way, you know. It's I don't know if you've heard anything of the Sea of Faith movement. Well, it's associated with Don Cupid, the radical theologian in Britain, and now it's a movement in New Zealand. And at one of the conferences, I offered a little workshop called Christianity Without God. And I did it with a bit of tongue-in-cheek, really, because it sounds absurd. How can you have Christianity without God? However, it aroused so much interest that somebody put it on the internet. And then somebody in America found it on the internet and drew attention to Polbridge publishers about it. And so Bob Funk, who was at the head of Polbridge and the Westside Institute, said, couldn't you write a book about it? And I said, well, I don't know that I could really. I'll have a go. So I wrote Christianity Without God. Now, in the course of this, it was really tracing to my own thinking about God. Because when I came into the church and they all talked about God, I didn't know quite what to make of God. I knew that image of an old man in the sky was just an image, and I was content really to feel I knew nothing about God, that God was the supreme mystery about life. And then I gradually came to it, as a result of reading a good deal of theology, came to refine that. So in this book, I have tried to show that when I say Christianity without God, I mean Christianity without the theistic view of God. Now, the theism is the term which means you think of God as a personal being. Of course, infinite compared with us, but nevertheless one who thinks and plans and performs miracles and answers prayers. That's theism. Well, what I want to say is that view of God no longer gels for me, no longer gels for a lot of people. Now, it doesn't mean to say I'm casting the word God away. No, I've got to learn. If I use the word God at all, I've got to use it in a different way from that. Indeed, one great Roman Catholic scholar said, right back in the 60s, we have to learn to speak of God in a radically new way. So Christianity without God means Christianity without that old idea of God, but it leaves God language free. Of course, you don't have to use God language. God language is a symbolic language, and theology has much more in common with poetry than it has with science. because it has to do with that highest dimension of the human experience, that sometimes we call it the spiritual dimension, because we haven't got adequate words to describe it otherwise. But that's why it links it up with poetry and the arts, the visual arts, the dramatic arts, the storytelling arts. There we have mediums through which we can use in order to reach out to that which is beyond us. So if I use the word God at all, though I'm more careful now, because you see, it's ceasing to be a word that you can use without explaining what you mean by it. Otherwise, people assume you're meaning the theistic God. So in some ways, it's better not to talk about God at all. But if I do mean, I do so in the way a theologian, Gordon Kaufman, from whom I've learnt much, suggested, that the word God has played a very important role in the Western world. Not simply because of that image which has to go, but because of what it did. It was a central point. Now, to illustrate this, let me say, when our pioneering forebears came to Australia and New Zealand, to what they thought was a sort of virgin land, forget about the Maoris and the Aborigines, and took it over and planned how to use it, their surveyors had to come in. And what did the surveyor do? He went to the nearest hill and put a trig station. And from that trig station, he measured out the land, and it was given out in plots. Now, the trig station was on a chosen bit. That is, it was humans who decided where the trig station was to be. But having chosen it, it then became a central point to which they referred for the land. Now, the word God has played that role in the Western world. If you don't know a thing, you say, only God knows that. Who made the world? Don't know. God made the world. That's how we answered all the difficult questions of our children as they're growing up. Used God as a reference point. So the use of the word God as a reference point is very good. Now, what is my reference points? I was asked this recently when they did a television documentary about me. What was my reference points? And I said, well, they are values. The things I value most, I said, are love and justice and compassion and goodwill and honesty, and so it goes on. And then I said, and those are for me God. In that sense, I think God language has a very important role to play. But in the traditional sense of that image, as John Robinson said in 1963, that image of God has to go.
So don't let anyone tell you that just because you're 92 years of age, you should sit back and do nothing and put on your slippers and so on. Did you hear what he said? Well, don't forget what he said, just look at the man. Isn't that marvellous, that 92 years of age and he can produce a speech like that? Terrific.